It is chilling to realize that as far back as 1305, the capital of London was already a sophisticated stage for state-sponsored terror, and on that humid August morning, the typical market noise was drowned out by the anticipation of violence. This gathering fury, focused entirely on the man known as William Wallace, was designed not merely to end a life, but to eradicate the very concept of Scottish defiance he represented, ensuring that the roar of the bloodthirsty crowd would be the last thing he ever heard, a stark warning against, challenging the centralized power of the English monarchy. While popular imagination often softens the final moments of heroes, depicting a clean, swift departure for the brave knight, the historical record insists on a far more sinister and calculated brutality. King Edward I, whose nickname Longshanks perfectly encapsulated his dominating presence and ruthless efficiency, had meticulously engineered Wallace's punishment less as legal retribution and more as an indelible message. This act was deliberately crafted to be a spectacle of destruction, publicly witnessed, meticulously performed, and thoroughly documented, serving as the ultimate deterrent against any who harbored thoughts of questioning English dominion over the North. If this kind of deep, unfiltered history matters to you, consider joining the channel. The comments are where the real discussion happens, and I read them. The decision to inflict hanging, drawing, and quartering, a punishment reserved exclusively for high treason, was not accidental. It represented the absolute pinnacle of judicial cruelty available to the medieval English state. This was not a quick dispatch. It was a strategic, systematic obliteration of human dignity, designed specifically to crush all hope and create a terrifying memory that would embed itself deep within the collective consciousness of the Scottish people for centuries to come. Today, we must confront the uncomfortable fact that the myth of Wallace often overshadows the unflinching reality of those final, excruciating hours, a truth that defines the entire political calculus of the time. To fully grasp the shocking horror of Wallace's fate, it is essential to first understand the unstable world from which he sprang. Medieval Scotland during the late 13th and early 14th centuries, a region perpetually oscillating between precarious independence and outright subjugation. Following a severe succession crisis, the Scottish Wars of Independence had erupted, providing Edward I the perfect pretext to forcefully incorporate Scotland, which he viewed not as a sovereign peer but as a troublesome, rebellious province, requiring harsh discipline. Emerging from this volatile socio-political landscape, William Wallace was not a titled noble maneuvering for the crown, but a minor landowner fueled primarily by profound personal loss and visceral national outrage against the occupation. His family had directly suffered under the English heel, and when he finally rose up at Stirling Bridge in 1297, it was with the focused, terrible energy of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain for a free Scotland. That subsequent victory at Stirling was transformative, demonstrating not only the tactical possibility of defeating formidable English heavy cavalry, but crucially, transforming the abstract concept of Scottish independence into a tangible, achievable reality. However, Edward I was an unrelenting ruler who maintained a zero-tolerance policy for defiance. Having previously demonstrated his iron will during the brutal suppression of Welsh resistance and his infamous expulsion of the Jews from England, Longshanks understood that the fire of rebellion, once ignited by figures like Wallace, must not merely be dampened, but utterly extinguished, necessitating that Wallace's success be not just reversed, but cynically transformed into an ultimate cautionary tale. The English king's overarching goal was to ensure the consequences of challenging his authority were so dire and overwhelming that they would successfully deter multiple future generations from even considering resistance. The political environment of 1305 formed a critical backdrop to Wallace's grim destiny, as by this time the majority of the Scottish nobility had prudently submitted to Edward's authority, preferring uneasy accommodation over assured annihilation. Wallace's continued, defiant refusal to yield made him an existential threat, not only to England, but also an increasingly embarrassing liability to the compromising Scottish aristocracy who had already chosen the path of submission. Therefore, his capture transitioned from a military objective to a political imperative, as his very existence powerfully delegitimized Scotland's voluntary surrender. The hunt for William Wallace proved to be an extensive, years-long endeavor, relying heavily on a sophisticated network of English spies, paid informants, and opportunistic Scottish collaborators who ensured the substantial bounty Edward Ide had placed on Wallace's head would eventually pay off. The English administration in Scotland executed a systematic isolation campaign, steadily cutting Wallace off from any potential support until the net surrounding him gradually tightened as former allies, driven by fear, greed, or the basic instinct for survival, eventually turned against him. In a tragically familiar pattern, the ultimate betrayal materialized from within the Scottish ranks. In August 1305, Wallace was successfully captured near Glasgow, a moment attributed by many accounts to the treachery of Sir John Menteith, a Scottish knight who had shrewdly submitted to Edward's dominion. While the precise circumstances of the betrayal remain a matter of historical debate, the consequence was immediate and undeniable. The man who had embodied the very spirit of Scottish resistance was finally and firmly in English custody. Though his capture was greeted with massive celebrations in London, for Edward I, it was merely the prelude to the complete and utter public humiliation he had meticulously planned for his greatest adversary. The calculated journey from Scotland down to London was itself a harrowing form of psychological torture, intentionally designed to systematically break Wallace's spirit long before the final punishment was administered. Bound and under heavy guard, Wallace was deliberately paraded through numerous English towns, drawing massive crowds eager to gawk at the infamous Scottish rebel in his degraded state, a calculated act of psychological warfare that successfully transformed a celebrated leader into a public curiosity, a hero into a gruesome spectacle. By the time Wallace finally reached London, he had already endured weeks of profound degradation. Yet this protracted physical and mental ordeal was still only a preamble to the horrors awaiting him. The trial of William Wallace, subsequently held at Westminster Hall on August 23, 1305, was undeniably a legal farce, but it fulfilled an essential propaganda purpose for the English crown. The proceedings were conducted entirely in Latin, a language Wallace reportedly struggled to comprehend, and he faced an exhaustive list of charges, including treason, murder, sacrilege, and various other serious offenses against the English crown. Contemporary observers understood the profound irony. Wallace was being tried for treason against a king whose legitimacy and sovereignty he had steadfastly refused to recognize. When finally afforded the chance to speak, Wallace's defiant declaration that he could not be guilty of treason against Edward I because he had never sworn fealty and was therefore not a subject instantly sealed his doom. This meticulously orchestrated trial was essentially political theater, designed only to provide a thin legal justification for an execution whose outcome was predetermined from the moment of his capture. The judges, all personally appointed by Edward I, had zero intention of offering mercy to the man who had so successfully galvanized Scottish resistance. Instead, the charges against Wallace were selectively crafted to ensure the maximum severity of his subsequent punishment. Treason, the most egregious offense, carried the full legal weight and horror of hanging, drawing, and quartering, while the added charges of murder and sacrilege, referencing attacks on English soldiers and clergy, were included solely to publicly brand him as a common criminal, effectively stripping him of any status as a warrior. The English legal system had, in this context, been ruthlessly weaponized as an instrument of state terror, and Wallace was destined to be its most high-profile and horrific casualty. The final sentence was proclaimed with chilling ceremonial gravity. Wallace was condemned to be drawn through London's streets, hanged by the neck but hut down while still alive, disemboweled while conscious, beheaded, and finally, his body was to be systematically cut into 4 distinct pieces. Each stage of this horrific process was deeply symbolic. The drawing signified his degradation, the hanging represented divine and earthly rejection, the disemboweling targeted his spiritual corruption, and the quartering ensured his complete physical annihilation. The morning of August 23, 1305, dawned clear and unseasonably warm over London, a city that had spent days in preparation, erecting scaffolds and drawing crowds from all corners of England eager to witness the death of the feared Scottish rebel. The English authorities had deliberately transformed Wallace's execution into a grotesque public holiday, complete with vendors selling food and drink to the assembled masses, emphasizing that this was not merely justice, but state-sanctioned entertainment. This spectacle was intended as a potent reminder of the unyielding power of the English crown and the catastrophic fate awaiting any challenger. Wallace was first forcibly stripped, then securely bound to a hurdle, a rough wooden frame that would drag him through the heart of the city, along a route carefully chosen to maximize both the humiliation and the exposure. Starting from the Tower of London, where he had been held, the morbid procession was forced through the busiest thoroughfares, ensuring that every citizen would witness his degradation firsthand, the sharp cobblestones tearing at his flesh as the horses dragged him, leaving behind a visible trail of blood that marked his final, painful journey. The crowds lining the streets were a heterogeneous mix of morbid curiosity seekers, fervent English patriots, and those simply drawn by the inherent human desire to witness suffering, reflective of how commonplace medieval executions were as public demonstrations of royal authority. These spectators actively jeered and threw refuse at Wallace as he passed, their base behavior intentionally encouraged by the authorities who demanded his final moments be as deeply humiliating as possible. The procession maintained a deliberate, agonizingly slow pace, granting maximum time for the crowds to swell and for Wallace's torment to be prolonged. Though contemporary accounts vary, they often describe Wallace remaining conscious throughout this entire ordeal, his gaze unnervingly fixed on a distant point, as if he were somehow capable of looking beyond the immediate horror. Whether this steely demeanor was true defiance, stoic resignation, or sheer shock is impossible to determine, but multiple witnesses specifically noted that he never once cried out or pleaded for mercy, a powerful detail that would swiftly become central to his enduring legend. At Smithfield, the traditional execution ground for London, a permanent scaffold had been erected specifically for Wallace's death, surrounded by an even larger, more raucous crowd, with vendors creating a carnival-like atmosphere around the site of ritualized death. The professional executioner, a man undoubtedly experienced in dozens of such horrific killings, began his task with efficient, practiced cruelty. Wallace was first hanged by the neck, but the rope was positioned with gruesome precision to ensure prolonged strangulation rather than a quick, merciful break of the neck. The massive crowd watched raptly as he violently struggled for air, his face rapidly turning purple and his body convulsing in the terrible, universal dance of death by asphyxiation. Yet, just as the darkness of unconsciousness began to claim him, he was ruthlessly cut down, still fully alive and agonizingly aware of the events unfolding around him. What followed next constituted the single most horrific component of the entire ordeal. While Wallace was still fully conscious, the executioner began the process of ritualized disemboweling. Using a specialized sharp knife, he sliced open the abdomen and began systematically removing the internal organs, one by one. Harrowing contemporary accounts describe the victim's screams as unlike anything the witnesses had ever heard, a sound seemingly torn from the very deepest registers of human suffering. The executioner then ritualistically held up each organ for the crowd to witness, before brutally tossing it into a fire that had been deliberately prepared nearby. The symbolism inherent in burning Wallace's entrails was chillingly precise. In medieval belief, the bowels were considered the physical and spiritual seat of emotion and compassion. By burning them while he was still watching, the executioner was attempting to symbolically destroy Wallace's very humanity, reducing him to something less than human in the eyes of the ecstatic crowd. The putrid smell of burning flesh and internal organs permeated the air, adding another visceral layer of horror to an already nightmarish scene. Through all of this calculated trauma, records suggest Wallace remarkably remained conscious, his eyes wide and aware, even as his body was systematically being destroyed. The executioner's unique skill was not merely in inflicting maximum pain, but in expertly prolonging the victim's life as long as medically possible, ensuring that death would arrive as a final, desperate release. not as the natural conclusion of the suffering. Finally, and mercifully, the executioner moved to complete his ghastly work, severing Wallace's head with a single sharp stroke of an axe, thereby ending his profound agony. But the calculated humiliation continued relentlessly. Even in death, the severed head was immediately held aloft for the assembled crowd to view, blood still dripping from the neck, before being set aside for preservation and display. The body was then brutally sliced into 4 distinct quarters, each piece also held up for the crowd's inspection, like cuts of meat in a butcher's shop. The disposal of Wallace's remains was executed with the same political calculation as his capture and execution. His severed head was painstakingly dipped in tar to prevent decomposition, and then triumphantly mounted upon a spike on London Bridge, where it remained for many years as a clear, unmistakable warning to any who might dare challenge the ultimate authority of the English crown. Furthermore, the 4 quarters of his body were strategically dispatched to various major Scottish cities, Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, where they were publicly displayed as constant, grotesque reminders of the unavoidable fate awaiting rebels. This gruesome distribution of Wallace's dismembered body was far more than mere brutality. It served as a calculated form of political communication. Each piece functioned as a pointed message to the regional population, a physical, visceral reminder of English power and the devastating consequences of sustained resistance. The English elite fundamentally understood that symbols could wield power equal to or greater than armies, and Wallace's destroyed body was intentionally transformed into the ultimate symbol of English dominance over Scotland. The immediate aftermath of Wallace's execution perfectly aligned with Edward I's desired outcome. The brutal, overwhelming spectacle initially caused Scottish resistance to seemingly crumble entirely in the face of such a horrific demonstration of overwhelming English power. Many who had once supported Wallace either immediately fled the country or quickly submitted to English rule, calculating that no cause, no matter how noble, was worth such a fate. For a fleeting moment, the execution appeared to have successfully inverted a symbol of resistance into a potent warning against rebellion. However, Edward I had fatally miscalculated the deeply ingrained Scottish response to martyrdom. Instead of successfully crushing Scottish resistance, the profound brutality of Wallace's execution paradoxically strengthened it. The sheer horror of his death became an immediate, powerful rallying cry for those who utterly refused to accept English domination. Robert the Bruce, who would later emerge as the true King of Scots, was reportedly spurred to decisive action by the chilling spectacle of Wallace's public execution, recognizing in it the true, ruthless face of English rule. The agonizing manner of Wallace's death also fundamentally influenced the strategic approach of future Scottish resistance movements. The lesson was stark and immediate. Capture by the English meant certain torture and humiliation beyond comprehension. This chilling knowledge fostered a new, desperate, and utterly determined form of warfare, where Scottish fighters preferred death in battle over the guaranteed, horrific outcome of surrender. Wallace's execution had inadvertently fostered a severe culture of no quarter, where mercy was neither sought nor expected. The political ramifications of the execution resonated powerfully beyond Scotland's borders. Other European kingdoms observed the Wallace execution with a mixture of intense interest and deep-seated horror, seeing in it a chilling demonstration of extreme English methods that could easily be applied to them. The widely reported brutality of the execution contributed significantly to England's developing international reputation, ultimately leading to a degree of diplomatic isolation that complicated English foreign policy in the decades that followed. Edward I's intended message of overwhelming strength had certainly been received, but so too had a clear message of unchecked cruelty. The historical documentation concerning Wallace's execution is surprisingly extensive, drawing from multiple contemporaneous sources that collectively offer a remarkably detailed, if gruesome, picture of the event. For example, the Lanercost Chronicle, written by English monks, describes the execution with clinical detail, noting the crowd's aggressive reaction and the prolonged duration of Wallace's suffering. Though these accounts naturally carry a bias towards the English perspective, they nonetheless provide valuable, if disturbing, insight into prevailing medieval attitudes toward judicial punishment. Conversely, Scottish sources, while fewer in number due to the occupation, offer a distinctly different perspective on the execution. The Chronicle of John of Fordoun portrays Wallace as an unflinching martyr who confronted his horrific death with extraordinary dignity and courage, specifically emphasizing his principled refusal to beg for mercy or renounce his cause. These narratives, though potentially romanticized in parts, clearly reflect the devastating emotional impact of Wallace's death on Scottish national consciousness and the powerful transformation of a decisive military defeat into a profound moral victory. Perhaps the most objective records of the events are found in the legal documentation of Wallace's trial and execution, meticulously preserved within the English National Archives. These documents clearly reveal the immense and careful planning that underpinned both the mock trial and the subsequent execution. Every single detail was documented, from the precise charges leveled against Wallace to the final, calculated disposal of his remains, strongly suggesting that the English authorities were keenly aware they were constructing a moment of monumental historical significance. Eyewitness accounts from both English and Scottish observers add crucial layers of detail to the execution narrative. Some accounts vividly describe the crowd's bloodthirsty, enthusiastic participation, while others emphasize the astonishing dignity with which Wallace reportedly faced his final moments. These varied perspectives underscore the sheer complexity of the event and its diverse, often contradictory, meanings for different sectors of the medieval audience. The profound legacy of William Wallace's execution extends far beyond the immediate political reverberations of his death, ultimately shaping centuries of Scottish identity. In the ensuing centuries, his narrative became a foundational myth of Scottish nationalism, serving as an enduring inspiration for generations of Scots committed to resisting foreign domination. The sheer brutality of his execution ironically transformed him from a defeated rebel into a powerful, immortalized symbol of martyrdom and resistance, a figure far more potent in death than he had ever been in life. Remarkably, the execution also subtly influenced the nascent development of international law and early concepts of human rights, as later legal scholars frequently cited Wallace's treatment as a prime example of judicial cruelty that flagrantly violated fundamental principles of human dignity. The revolutionary notion that even declared enemies of the state deserved some level of basic human treatment began to slowly emerge, fueled in part as a horrified reaction against official excesses like Wallace's grotesque public ordeal. The vast cultural impact of Wallace's sacrifice is evident across countless works of literature, art, and music that emerged in subsequent centuries. From traditional medieval ballads to epic modern films, his narrative has been continually retold, with each new generation discovering fresh meaning in his ultimate sacrifice. The visceral execution scene, in particular, has become a powerful, universal symbol of the relentless struggle between systemic oppression and liberty, tyranny and justice. For the Scottish people, the psychological impact was profound and indelibly lasting. Wallace's execution created a deep, collective trauma that gradually became woven into the very fabric of Scottish cultural identity, a shared memory of suffering that paradoxically united the nation in ways mere military victory could never have achieved. The sheer horror of his death became a perverse source of national strength, a testament that certain core principles were indeed worth suffering for, and that dignity could be maintained even when confronting absolute, ultimate degradation. The specific method of execution chosen for Wallace, hanging, drawing, and quartering, was itself a profound statement about the nature of medieval justice and the relationship between the governing ruler and the governed subject. This particular, severe form of execution was strictly reserved for the crime of treason, for those who had fatally violated the supposedly sacred bond between the king and his subject. By applying it to Wallace, Edward I was fiercely asserting that all inhabitants of the British Isles, regardless of their personal allegiance, were unequivocally his subjects. The inherently public nature of the execution was equally significant, as medieval justice was essentially performance art designed to rigorously reinforce established social hierarchies and political relationships through dramatic spectacle. Wallace's execution stands as arguably the most elaborate and terrifying such performance of its era, involving not only the physical obliteration of the victim, but the calculated psychological conditioning of the massive audience. The crowd was not just passively witnessing justice, they were actively participating in a central, terrifying ritual of state power. The detailed documentation of the execution strongly suggests that the English authorities consciously understood they were manufacturing a defining historical moment. The meticulous recording of every detail, from the precise route of the procession to the calculated disposal of the body parts, indicates a clear intent for the event to be eternally remembered. The execution was never solely about punishing Wallace, but about successfully forging a controlling narrative that would staunchly serve English political interests for generations to come. Furthermore, the international dimension of the execution should not be overlooked. Medieval Europe was a highly interconnected political sphere where news traveled with surprising speed and a ruler's reputation held enormous weight. Wallace's execution was observed by foreign dignitaries and widely reported across the continent, solidifying England's growing reputation as a powerful nation willing to employ the most extreme measures to maintain territorial control, a reputation that would directly influence its diplomatic relations for decades. As we intensely reflect on the full horror of William Wallace's final day, we are forced to confront several uncomfortable truths about human nature and the unfettered exercise of state power. The vast crowds that enthusiastically gathered to watch his drawn-out suffering were not inherently monstrous, but ordinary people who had been psychologically conditioned to accept, and even derive pleasure from, the systematic destruction of another human life. Their collective enthusiasm for the spectacle reveals the latent capacity for profound cruelty that always exists within civilized society when it is explicitly given official sanction. The execution also serves as a terrifying demonstration of how swiftly the truly extraordinary can become terrifyingly routine. The executioner who efficiently dismembered Wallace was simply a professional skilled in the dark art of prolonging suffering. The officials who organized the entire event were merely bureaucrats, diligently following established procedures for dealing with convicted traitors. This normalization of extreme cruelty is arguably more profoundly disturbing than the cruelty itself, suggesting that the veneers of civilization are always far more fragile than we care to believe. The ultimate transformation of Wallace from a simple rebel to an enduring martyr illustrates the fundamentally unpredictable nature of political symbolism. Edward I's explicit intent for the execution was to demonstrate the utter futility of resistance, but instead it generated an intensely powerful, enduring symbol of the nobility of selfless sacrifice for deeply held principles. The very excess of the execution contributed directly to its failure as a deterrent. The horror was so complete that it tragically transcended its immediate purpose, transforming into something far larger and eternally resonant. The enduring global fascination with Wallace's narrative speaks powerfully to the human need for heroes who perfectly embody our highest ideals, particularly, and perhaps especially, when confronted by ultimate suffering. His horrific execution serves as a vital reminder that the most significant victories are sometimes profoundly moral rather than merely military, that essential dignity can be fiercely maintained even when every other physical thing is stripped away, and that the unwavering human spirit can ultimately triumph even in the final, brutal moment of the body's destruction. Ultimately, the story of William Wallace's public execution remains a quintessential narrative about the devastating price of freedom and the profound cost of adhering to principle. In our comfortable modern existence, it is exceedingly easy to forget that the fundamental liberties we casually take for granted were purchased with the unimaginable blood and suffering of those who came before us. Wallace's horrific death stands as a stark, timeless reminder that freedom is never truly free, and that those who enjoy it bear an immense responsibility to honor the sacrifice of those who violently died to secure it. This video is created for educational and historical purposes. It examines themes of power, corruption, and human conflict without depicting explicit or graphic events. Today, as contemporary societies grapple with their own challenges to personal freedom and human dignity, Wallace's sacrifice retains its chilling relevance. The methods of oppression may have technologically changed, but the fundamental struggle between entrenched authority and individual liberty continues unabated. His final hours remind us that there are still principles absolutely worth suffering for. causes worthy of dying for, and that the challenging choice between comfortable security and fierce freedom is one that every single generation must ultimately make for itself. The blood-soaked cobblestones of medieval London echo still with his unspoken message, a chilling testament that some ideals are worth any price, and that the undaunted human spirit, even when seemingly broken, can still inspire others across centuries to tenaciously carry on the fight.